Brace yourselves for a memorable monitor name. It's the iiyama G-Master GB2590HSU-B1. That's quite laughable, but its gaming performance certainly isn't. Here it has a 24.5-inch form factor, it's 240Hz, Full HD IPS panel, also runs HDR400 and AMD FreeSync. Furthermore, it comes in at an affordable price of £260, making it one of the cheapest in its class. So is that actually worth its price tag? Let's find out. So jumping straight into the deep end, let's talk about its input lag, and here it was seriously impressive. I actually had it tested at 2.5 milliseconds, which is one of the fastest I've tested to date, and furthermore is seriously impressive when I put it through its paces on CSGO. The overall input that I was able to register via my mouse was absolutely excellent. No complaints whatsoever in this department. Similarly, when it comes to its response time, in its maximum overdrive mode, which is level 5, there was minimal inverse ghosting. Now don't get me wrong, there is some inverse ghosting that is present, and you'll be able to see it over here on this UFO test, but when it comes to real life applications, and in other words when you're playing such as potato looking games such as CSGO, then you're not going to have too much of a problem, and it didn't throw off my shots in the slightest. Now of course, if you're playing far more graphically intense games, you might want to dial it down one notch to level 4, but that said, when I was playing some Destiny 2 as well, I still had no problems in terms of seeing any sort of purple trailing. Ultimately, what I'm trying to portray over here is that the overall response time of the monitor is seriously impressive, and I could see myself using this on a day-to-day basis if I was playing some hardcore competitive shooters or indeed any other games out there on the market. Now I should mention that this monitor has an HDMI 2.0 port and a DisplayPort 1.4 port, which does mean that it's perfectly suitable to be playing 240Hz at Full HD. You'll of course want to make sure that the other end of the chain, in other words your GPU, or let's say your laptop's GPU, does have the appropriate port version in order to output the maximum refresh rate and resolution of this monitor. Suffice to say, I had no problems with my RTX 3080 and my Core i9-9900K, which is important to mention for CPU bound games such as CSGO. So aside from hardcore competitive gaming, what about its other gaming credentials? Well, it does have AMD FreeSync technology built in, and while I can't test for this, I do have an RTX 3080, and when connected over to DisplayPort, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo without any sort of artifacts or black screen issues. Better still, I was able to run G-Sync with 240Hz at Full HD while also running HDR without any problems while playing Destiny 2. Suffice to say, I have no issues here, and it is worth bearing in mind that its FreeSync or indeed G-Sync range stretches from 48Hz all the way up to 240Hz. Now this perfectly leads me onto its HDR400 support, and indeed it has HDR, but quite frankly it's pretty poor. Very much like its Asus counterpart, I was not left impressed when I was playing Destiny 2. Colors didn't pop as much, they seemed a little bit off as well in terms of the overall accuracy, and as for the superior experience that one might have potentially attained over SDR, well, it simply wasn't there. If you're really looking for HDR and you're looking at such a monitor, then you might want to be looking at 1440p HDR 600 monitors instead, because they will provide you a far superior visual experience. Elsewhere, it's worth bearing in mind that this monitor has got MBR, and this means motion blur reduction, and can provide a superior gaming experience, although it's worth bearing in mind that here MBR does limit the overall brightness, or indeed caps it at certain levels. We'll talk about this very shortly in terms of the overall brightness of the monitor. But here you should also know that it doesn't run simultaneously with AMD FreeSync and or NVIDIA G-Sync, and this might be a bit of a problem for certain individuals out there, and as such, if it is, then you might want to look at the Asus alternative instead. So with the gaming section out of the way, how does the 24.5-inch flat IPS panel look like? Well, it's got an 8-bit color depth and it's got a matte coating, which is no surprise given the monitor class and indeed its competitors. Now when put across my calibrators, I noted a 97.8% sRGB gamma coverage and 113.5% sRGB gamma volume. You can see over here how it compares to the sRGB standard, and here it had an average delta of 1.8 and a maximum of 6.32. I was actually expecting it to be a little bit better. Now note this was when it was set to its warm preset on the OSD, because I felt that it resulted in the best experience. You can also enable iStyle color, but this will lock its brightness at 300 nits, and it didn't have a positive effect in terms of the overall color accuracy accuracy, in other words the average delta E or maximum delta E, nor the gamut coverage or gamut volume. It doesn't have an sRGB mode is ultimately what I'm trying to say. Now as for the overall brightness level, it gets up to 390 nits. I couldn't get it to hit 400 nits in HDR, which I found a little bit odd, but nevertheless 390 hits is almost the 400 nits standard, and as for minimum it gets down to 84 nits. You'll also be able to see the level of MBR modes, which there are 7 to choose from, and how this affects the brightness, and indeed this will cap it and lock it at said brightnesses. As for the tested contrast ratio, it's perfectly impressive at 1206 to 1 for an IPS panel, and as for the measured white point, it wasn't actually too far off, and nor was the gamma. Now given it's an IPS panel, you might be worried about backlight bleed and brightness uniformity. Well, at least on the tested model that I have, and I do understand that it is somewhat panel lottery, I had no problems in both departments. Both brightness uniformity, as you'll be able to see, wasn't too bad across the screen, and similarly when it came to backlight bleed, it was very minimal. At least in my case, when I play regular games, I had no such issues, but of course if you want very minimal backlight bleed, you might want to look at a TN or VA panel, whereby the latter will also offer superior contrast ratio. So now we get onto the monitor's OST that can be accessed through a set of physical buttons found at the bottom right of the monitor, making it quite convenient to access the settings. Now here you'll find a plethora of options. Now through here you've got the overdrive, which I did reference before, so you might want to leave it on level 5 or dial it one notch down to level 4 depending on the games that you're playing. And as for MBR, I did mention about this, how it affects the overall brightness of the monitor. Now moving to input select, it's pretty self-explanatory, but you've got the audio settings. Now this monitor does have two 2-watt speakers. They're not exactly that impressive, but you have got them there available for you to use if you so wish. Now as for the color settings, I would recommend the warm setting and actually leaving the RGB values as the default, which is 100. Of course you can play around with them to your heart's content. Similarly, in terms of iStyle color, you can enable or disable it through this menu, although do bear in mind what I mentioned before, it does lock the brightness to a certain level. You've also got the sharp and soft settings which you can play around with. I think 3, which is the default, actually does a pretty good job on the whole, so I wouldn't change it. Language and setup menu are all pretty self-explanatory. The only thing to mention over here is that you have got the AMD FreeSync Premium on and off toggle over here, and it's worth bearing in mind, as I did mention before, that AMD FreeSync can't be used simultaneously with MBR, which isn't the same thing that could be said about some of its competitors. And finally, you do have the display information that you can see if HDR is enabled or not, and the resolution and the refresh rate of the monitor. So with my settings out of the way, I should mention that the overall design and the stand is certainly impressive. It doesn't have a garish sort of red color design like some of its competitors, and similarly here the stand provides a really sturdy feel. You can of course replace it if you so wish via VESA compatible stand if you so wish. Now the built-in stand itself provides height and tilt and rotation adjustment, however it can't be pivoted, although that should be a non-issue for most individuals. Elsewhere it's got a 3-side borderless design and a relatively small bezel at the bottom with a quite nice little brushed aluminium type of finish, which I certainly think will look good in most desktop setups. And so this brings me on to my verdict of the iiyama G-Master GB2590HSU-B1. I can't believe I've actually memorized that. Now this monitor is actually seriously impressive when it comes to its input lag, response time, refresh rate, the resolution at least for the price it comes in at, and the overall color accuracy will certainly suffice for a lot of gamers out there. It also has HDR support which one-ups the AOC alternative, and while it doesn't have ELMB support like the Asus alternative, it is a little bit cheaper than the Asus mentioned. As a result of all of this, I certainly can see myself actively recommending it, and as such it actually gets my Best Buy award. Now I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts of the monitor down in the comment section below, and if you've got any questions of course do pop them down there as well. Now if you've liked this independent detail review and want to see more from the channel, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated. And if you've done that already, I'm just going to thank you in advance. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.